Well, hello everyone. I'm Nori Henk, and I will be moderating the panel discussion on Christian nationalism and the attack on the U.S. Capitol. The panelists that we have today are Alan Oda, Jess Wong, and Chris Christopherson. Alan Oda has served at APU for the past 25 years as a professor of psychology. His research is with Asian American parent-child relations and interventions for children recovering from natural disasters. He currently serves on the university's Faculty Senate and Faculty Diversity Committee. He also serves as the co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the National Collegiate Honors Council. He was also previously board chair and director of the Asian American Christian Counseling Service. He's an LA native where he attended UC Davis, CSU Northridge, and UC Riverside. Jessica Y-Fong Wong is an associate professor of systematic theology at Azusa Pacific University and works in political theology with a focus on race, gender, society, and visual theory. She is an ordained ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church of USA and holds degrees in Christian theology, ethics from Duke Divinity School and Duke University. In addition to journal articles and chapter contributions, she is the author of Disordered, The Holy Icon, and Racial Myths, forthcoming August 2021 with Baylor University Press, and a co-author of Lamenting Racism, a Christian Response to Racial Injustice, published this year. Her current work considers the role of anger in the struggle against racial injustice in the United States. And finally, Chris Christopherson is Emeritus faculty here at APU. He began, Professor Emeritus since 2014. He also taught at Wheaton College. He has his BA, my bad. Okay, so he just taught at Azusa Pacific University. He got his BA at Wheaton College in sociology and literature. And then he got his MA and PhD in sociology from University of California, Davis. He taught at University of California, Davis, University of Redlands, and Azusa Pacific University. And finally, his research and teaching interests are in cultural sociology, especially as it relates to religion, art, literature, and urban life. So we are talking about what happened on January 6th as our main area of interest as it relates to Christian nationalism, a very hot topic, but also very relevant to our religious community. So I will be asking each of the panelists the same questions. There will be 3 of them. So we'll go ahead and start with the first question. What connections do you see between race, Christianity, and American identity? How did we get here and why does it persist? And Alan Oda will start us off with that question.
What I'm going to be saying is going to be kind of general. I think we'll get more specific with the latter questions. And I do want to qualify that I'm definitely not qualified to talk about the early history of the faith. I'm not seminary trained or ordained. I do realize, though, that one of the things that is important is understanding cultural contextualization of understanding God's truth. And I remember a pastor once saying in a sermon, think Hebrew when you read the scriptures. And I think that that's kind of gives you an insight over the importance of understanding culture and faith. When it comes to U.S. and American identity, maybe I might have a thought or two that's helpful. One thing is when the founding fathers came up with the concept of the freedom of religion. Okay, I think that that was really freedom of religion in the sense of how it was practiced by the history with the Church of England and things such as that. And it was when the US was a much more homogeneous culture. So was it really true freedom of religion or freedom from the Church of England? I kind of wondered about that. I was just thinking about this question. Now that the US is much more culturally diverse, you have people from all over the world who are now here in the US, it's much more complex. And I even wonder if the founding fathers realized that that's what we're looking at. The foundation of American culture really is on what you would say Protestant Christianity. And so I think that that's something that will always be part of that conversation. I think also that this sort of sometimes problematic confluence between Christianity and culture here in the US. In a moment, I'm going to just mention a comment or two about the ethnic churches that I think are something that are both a significant part of the American Protestant church, but at the same time actually attracts some controversy. Even churches that use are foreign language churches sometimes are things that people question a little bit. And even if you think about it, there's diversity within even denominations. I think there's the Missouri Synod of the Lutheran Church, and I think there's different forms. Like my background is Free Methodist, and I know that Methodism has United Methodists, Free Methodists, the Church of Nazarene is our cousins, and things such as that. So there's that diversity that's there, and it hasn't always been all that of a harmonious type of situation. I think it's that latter part that really interests me in terms of, is there really one definition of American Christianity? And is that a prevailing belief? One of the things I think we get into it, the trap we get into is the scriptures call for us to be unified, to have a unity of the faith. And in my understanding of the scriptures, I think we sometimes make a mistake making the terms unity and uniformity as somehow being the same. And I think that's one of the concerns that I have, is that by emphasizing unity and at the same time saying that uniformity is the only way to get there, I think I just have some concerns with that. So I remember talking to a colleague talking about diversity in the church and their concerns about whether or not people who are of various kinds of ethnic heritages or traditions and things like that, would they be accepted in the American Protestant tradition. And I thought some of the points this individual raised was really good, but their solution was to say that we just need to have more multicultural churches. And I think multicultural churches are great, but I also think there's a value to ethnic fellowships where a person feels safe to be able to worship in their cultural context. And that kind of led to a very interesting discussion afterwards. I think we're still on speaking terms, but I think you get what I'm saying, is that I think that's just one example of some of the complexity we're dealing with. And the other thing, and I may address this in other questions, is that hence there's somehow an assimilation aspect to American Christianity. Is there this thing where if you're not a certain way, that you're not accepted by whatever our definition is of American Christianity? And I think that's something that also may explain why some of these things persist over time in terms of having this is the way Christianity is supposed to be practiced here in the US, and where do we go from there? So that's just my opening comments, and I'm hoping that obviously my colleagues will have much more useful things to say, and also at the same time like to expand upon this in the later questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I appreciate what you said. I think there's a lot to unpack there. So I guess as a theologian, I can maybe speak a little bit more to the history of the church and what's happening there. Someone like Willie Jennings, for example, would say that the fundamental issue can be found even in the early church, right? This is disassociation of Christianity and Judaism. And that the Gentile kind of non-Jewish Christians begin to see themselves as somehow superior or separate from the Jewish people, right? And over time, of course, you think about how do we imagine the Christian disciples, right? The early disciples. And oftentimes we imagine they look like us, as opposed to imagine them as thoroughly Jewish, which they were. And then, of course, that gets translated over to what did Jesus look like? So Jesus, over time, becomes less and less Jewish, disassociated from his own Jewish identity. And as a result of that, or over time, also more and more white, right? So during the Middle Ages, for example, you have this interesting theological move that's happening where external bodies start to be read as a sign of internal condition, right? Both internal condition in terms of spiritual order, but also internal condition in terms of one's aptitude to properly participate in Christendom, right? In Christian society, right? So orderly spiritual kind of sensibilities, orderly socio-political sensibilities, and the reading of the body all get tied up together. You see the same thing carried through in the colonial period as the colonists are encountering, these colonizers are encountering new people and new lands. And then you also can see this in US immigration in the 20th century, right? So the reading of immigrant bodies and the discernment of who is a person of proper character who will make a good American citizen, and who are the people who are going to be problematic and difficult to assimilate, right? All that's being read through the body. And so what you see here then is this this collapsing of spiritual, a proper spiritual sensibility and socio-political kind of identity that is circulating around the body. So I suppose that's how I'd answer that first question. And in terms of how to, in terms of like, oh, why does it persist? I think that in the end, it's an issue of our imaginations, right? We're taught how to see the world from very early ages. We're trained in all, sometimes overt, but oftentimes very subtle ways of how do we think about which people, right? What are the stories connected to which bodies? And so part of the solution then has to be a kind of a reimagination. How do we retrain ourselves and provide ourselves with different narratives?
I think, Chris, you're up next.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the two perspectives. I will confess I'm not a theologian either. I really appreciate that. I was going to introduce just a little bit of data to start here, and I think it will lead to something else. In 2017, at the American Sociological Association meeting in Montreal, a political scientist from the University of Maryland named Janelle Wong presented some new data that had been collected by a fairly large group of researchers from 10,000 respondents. And what they wanted to know, that the study was about race, religion, attitudes, and identity. And there were two little bits of insight that I think are really relevant to what we're talking about. Two patterns that they discovered. The first was that white evangelicals are more likely than all other racial and religious groups to believe that whites face more discrimination than any other group. I don't know if any of you have heard that. And the second point, which is very closely related, white evangelicals are far less likely compared to all other groups to believe that any other group faces significant discrimination. So for whatever reasons, white evangelicals see themselves as oppressed, as victims of discrimination. And at the same time, they see non-white, non-Christians, any other group as people who face little or no discrimination. And I just wanted to throw Gerardo Marti, who wrote a book called American Blind Spot, just recently teaches sociology at Davidson College, former colleague at APU. In his book, he was an eyewitness to the presentation of this data at the meeting. And he said, I heard gasps in a room on seeing the extent of the gap in perception. The assembled international experts on race and religion knew this mismatch in perception of discrimination to be a very significant development. The perception of which the perception of white evangelicals had become exceedingly skewed in relation to the actual discrimination faced by racial and religious minorities in the United States every day. And then Marty suggests that the attitudes of these white evangelicals, quote, reflect the ideological framework that bolsters support for Trump policies and support for such policies as his Muslim ban on refugees from the Middle East, on Homeland Security's claiming that they were keeping families safe from crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, The Department of Justice suing the universities with who had affirmative action programs claiming that they were discriminating. So these were all things that were enthusiastically supported by evangelical leaders. Of course, there's an overwhelming evidence that white Americans as a group are privileged. There is clear evidence that refugees on the southern border suffer, that Black people suffer from all sorts of injustice, including police violence. In both cases of discrimination, there are videos, there are eyewitness accounts. There's a long history of irrefutable evidence that these atrocities are not happening to white evangelical Americans. The facts of discrimination and oppression are clear, and the links that people in power go to avoid facing these things, I think is evidence in itself of widespread systematic racism. So that's my first contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you all. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second question here. White nationalism tends to be a particular issue for white evangelical forms of Christian theology. Why are they intertwined, and how do we detangle this relationship? And I believe, Jess, you'll be up first for this question.
Yeah, thanks, Nori. So I think part of what is unique about evangelical Christianity in comparison to other kind of mainline forms of Protestant Christianity in particular, just focusing on Protestantism, let alone all the other, is the way in which evangelicalism is almost Gnostic, right? So, and by Gnostic, we mean that there's kind of this separation of the spiritual and the material, and an elevation of the spiritual, right? So spiritual is far more important than the material. And in some ways, the material doesn't really matter all that much, right? So the eschewing of the body for the sake of the soul. And why that is important is that by focusing on the spiritual and the kind of transcendent, there is a space created to then detach Jesus from his Jewishness, right? It's only if we can look at Jesus in a way that says what really matters is the spiritual and not kind of the material embodied part, then what's really important is that Jesus is the Son of God, right? So that detaching of Jesus from his Jewishness then allows that extra move that I was talking about before, which is that movement into making Jesus white, and then later on, making Jesus American, right? So you see that sensibility even today, right? This idea that Jesus was actually an American man. And this connection then between Jesus and whiteness and American identity is something that renders certain attributes onto whiteness and onto Americanness, right? Such that whiteness becomes something transcendent. Whiteness becomes something universal, just as God is transcendent and universal. And Americanness becomes this ideal, right? It's almost divine. And you, for example, think of America considering itself as like God's chosen people, right? John Winthrop, City Upon the Hill, right? This idea that we will be a representation to the rest of the world, right? Of what it looks like to live in this godly way. Manifest destiny, this belief that God has ordained this movement, this expansion, right? All these things are tied up with this kind of conception of American identity. And if you look at the history of the founding of this country, right? Citizens were white men. Only white men were enabled to be full citizens, right? So this focus on Americanness as somehow special and God ordained, and this idea of whiteness as special and God ordained, right? These things go hand in hand. So the question about how do we detangle this relationship, right? I can't help but think back to Willie Jennings once again and his articulation of Gentile humility, right? So what does it look like for us as I assume at least in this room, non-Jewish people, right? To recognize the place of ourselves, like our location as Gentiles, and what it means to be a Gentile, what it means to be grafted into a story that was not originally our own, right? Which was a story of God with God's people who were Jewish, right? And our entry into that story, not by birthright, but by grace, right? And to look at ourselves as being grafted into the story, taking on another people's Messiah as our own Messiah, right? That's a place of vulnerability and a place of dependency. And of course, vulnerability and dependency aren't things that we necessarily love, especially as Americans. But that to embrace that kind of posture, I think changes everything, right? Because it suggests that the fullness of the truth of God is found in this encounter with others, right? Entering into the stories of others, people that don't look like us, people who don't sound like us, and that it's in those spaces that we find God, and it's in those spaces that we can truly encounter our fullest self, right? So that kind of posture of humility presses us towards different ways of being in the world that I think, if we take that seriously, especially within evangelical Christianity, could transform how we are in the world.
I think Chris, you're up next.
Yes, okay. I've been waiting for cues on that. I like that notion of, the stories, and it's not our own story. I think one of the key things about white Christian nationalism is they've created a different story. And that story is about America nation as something that was chosen by God and built by white Christian men. And there's a lot of emphasis in white nationalism about the purity of the group. It is also a political movement. It's not so much a religious movement. It's a search for power. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on here, because making a sociological observation of recent church history, white evangelical have not always been interested in political power. They have swung in that direction in later years and changed their strategy in response to changes in American society and culture. For most of the 20th century, evangelicals were revivalists. They were trying to get people saved, as many as possible. The goal was to bring as many people to Christ as you could, and that would, personal salvation for the masses, would ensure America's Christian future. That's how I grew up, in churches like that. Think Billy Graham, Oral Roberts, Campus Crusade for Christ, if you can remember them. Jesus loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. How can you resist it? Youth for Christ, kind of a enthusiastic church service mixed with Saturday Night Live. These were all evangelistic efforts. Nowadays, I think the hope for mass revival, for repentance, for changed hearts has been largely exchanged for access to political power. And that's really what Trump and January 6th were all about. It's tough guy leadership, and it's conservative policy, not piety, that these evangelical leaders think about. They've exchanged, Nori might appreciate this, the charismatic personal authority of the pulpit to the rational legal authority offered by Donald Trump. The primary goal is not salvation, but preservation of their institutions and religious traditions. Think Franklin Graham, Ralph Reed, Greg Laurie, Richard Land, James Dobson, Jim Baker, Jerry Falwell Jr. These are all the members of Trump's Evangelical Action Committee, as he called it. Actually, he said, these are my biggest pastors when he talks about this group. Trump is not a pious man. At George H.W. Bush's funeral, he did not move his lips when the assembled group was reciting the Apostles' Creed. More than 40 women have accused him of sexual harassment and abuse, but he is the president who has repeatedly promised to fight for the interests of white evangelicals. And I don't think Trump would be president if not for the evangelicals' pursuit of political power that he offered them, power for votes.
As Dr. Christopherson was sharing, it reminds me of Richard Foster. He has a book out entitled "The Challenge of the Disciplined Life." The original title of the book was "Money, Sex, and Power," and I just find it to be kind of apropos. Just as I hear you sharing about that, is I think that that's one of the things that has defined a lot of what I see the church turning towards. And I can't say that it's exclusive to the American church, but I do see some of those elements that are there. The only contribution I'm going to have, because I think both Dr. Wong and Dr. Christopherson articulated this question very well, is one thing is we seem to be adhering to what I think is a distorted perception of American exceptionalism. And the concern that I have is that when you throw in the concept of American exceptionalism in its current form, okay, and again, I'm not talking about the concept of exceptionalism in the sense of, is the US a special place? Yes, I think it is. Is it something that one can take pride in? I say you could do that. But what I'm concerned about is in the way that we are using exceptionalism, it also means that we can do no wrong. That because we're exceptional, that somehow or another, that everything we do is going to be valid and correct. And I think that's dangerous. I mean, to me, that's anti-scriptural. And again, I defer to the ordained to help me understand what that means. But I think that this idea that because we are, I think Dr. Wong said the thing about John Winthrop's thing about being the city on the hill, that we are going to be the example of Christianity for the rest of the world. That's a little problematic in my mind. I just think that that then puts us in the role of we are the only ones that have the answer, and I don't necessarily think that's what the scripture says. I mean, all fall short of the glory of God. I mean that you can apply that in different ways, but I think one of them is that we're not going to be perfect, and do we acknowledge that aspect of who we are? The other thing that I've also noticed about American Christianity is that it focuses upon the individual. Okay. And I do understand this, the importance of having that relationship with Christ. I get that. At the same time, there's a collectivist nature of the faith in terms of how we worship together. How is it that we, again, I mentioned the thing about all fall short of the glory of God. We are all seeking God's truth together. And I think sometimes that because the American culture is so afraid of collectivism, because that brings the discussion to socialism and even communism and things such as that, that by doing that, we're ignoring, I think, an important part of the practice of the faith of what we do together as well as what we do individually. And I think I think that's kind of helps at least me understand why is it that why certain forms of nationalism and things like that get kind of intertwined in all this, is because we focus upon we've got to protect individual rights at all cost, even if it means that we are not caring, we're not loving our neighbor, that we're not acknowledging the needs of the other, because we're all about our individual piety and faith. And I think that to me is that distortion that I'm concerned about, that may at least help me understand a little bit over what's going on in terms of our current practice of the faith.
Thank you, everyone. So we'll move on to our last question. What is the way forward for those who recognize the problem of racism embedded within their tradition or within their community and want to bring about change? And Chris, you'll be leading us on this question.
Okay, in many ways, this third topic is the most difficult one to address. What can we do about American racism is an enormous problem. I do think we've learned a lot about how we arrived where we are. The legacy of slavery and xenophobia and it's a heavy burden for the national conscience. Racism has from the very beginning been America's problem. And, we're asking, is there a way forward? I don't know I hope you have heard of Esau Macaulay or know something about him. I just recently got his book. I've been reading him in the New York Times without quite putting it all together, but he's a professor of New Testament at Wheaton College and author of Reading While Black. And he offers a distinctly Christian vision of social justice. So as a biblical scholar, his description of racism switches from racism as a problem, which is an apt sociological term, to racism as sin. And sin, not that different from things like greed or lust. And he reminds us that we are all made in God's image. We're all part of the same creation. His vision begins with profound respect for the dignity of every human being, which almost should go without saying, but really is up for grabs these days. Christians know about sin. We have been, if we've been paying attention, we probably should know what to do about sin. Acknowledge the sin, confess the sin, ask forgiveness for the sin, turn away from sin, restore the wrong that has been done. So none of that is easy. So Macaulay says, if racism is America's collective sin, then the tasks are begin by telling the truth about racism. Academics should be good at that. That's our job, to tell the truth. Turn away from racism, our own racism and the systematic racism that's embedded in virtually all of our institutions. And finally, offer reparations for racism. What do we owe the refugees at our border, the descendants of slaves who built the country, all those whose lives have been diminished and lost by the sin of racism? What's the cost of justice? I think I'll finish by just reading you a couple paragraphs from the last paragraphs from Macaulay's essay called What the Bible Has to Say About Black Anger. He says, hope is possible if we recognize that it does not rule out justice. It is what separates justice from vengeance. Rage, once unleashed, tends to spill out beyond its intended target and consume everything. The hatred of our enemy that we take to the streets returns to us in our friendships, our marriages, our communities. It damages our souls. Christians contend for justice because we care about Black lives, families, communities. We contend for reconciliation after the establishment of justice, because there must be a future that is more than mutual contempt and suspicion. But justice and reconciliation cannot come at the cost of Black lives. The only peaceful future is a just future. And Because Christians should be people for peace, we must be a people for justice, even if it seems to ever elude us. Too many Black lives have been lost to accept anything else. Amen.
Amen.
I go back to my previous comment about how we've somehow, I think, defined unity as uniformity. And I think that really fuels a lot of the issues that I think are associated with racism and why these things persist. One of the things that I'm learning is that for much of my life, I thought the whole concept of being colorblind was one of the things to attain, that somehow or another I didn't see color with people. And I now realize that was wrong, for lack of a better term, that rather than being colorblind, it's more important for me to be color aware, that there are people who are different than me, and to respect that, and to realize that God's creation is diverse. And so to move from colorblind to being color aware as a developmental psych person, I realize this is going to be a process. It's not going to happen overnight, but we do need to first own the fact that we do have, even though we claim that we are colorblind, in reality, no one is. All right. If you're not noticing, you're not paying attention. We are wired to notice differences. That's what keeps us. That's what allows us to survive. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned in my class is this whole thing about stereotypes, right? That we use stereotypes to simplify a complex world. Okay. And if you don't believe me, think about an individual who's being prepared to go on a mission trip in another country. Okay, they're going to be told certain things about that particular culture. Now, do they fit everybody in that culture? Probably not. Okay. At the same time, you want to be aware of the culture going into, with the mantra, maybe that's not the right term, but with the idea of they're not wrong, they're different. Right. And to acknowledge those differences just being because that's who they are is, I think, an important part of this discussion. So I think moving to more of a color aware and knowing there are differences, and to respect differences and know that, hey, we have something to learn from those differences, I think could be a very important an important step towards, at least, if not solving the issues of racism, at least to acknowledge it's there, and where can we go from that point. So yeah, it's only a start, and I realize that, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, thank you for that. Chris, when you're talking earlier about Macaulay's work and this idea of sin, I wasn't planning actually on talking about this, but I think it is very relevant, and I would love to touch on it as well, because racism is a sin. But I think what's really particularly interesting is that racism, one could tie it to original sin, right? If we think about how we as human beings were created, right? We were created to be dependent on God. We were created to be vulnerable, right? We were created to be finite. We were created out of nothing, right? And then out of that nothing, like out of dust. So that just speaks to the kind of the weakness and the fragility of being a human being. And yet some theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, would argue that the original sin was actually our attempt to reject that, our rejection of our dependency upon God, and instead our attempt to usurp the place of God, right? And so our kind of turning away from that dependency upon God for Bonhoeffer, is also manifest in our turning away from our dependency upon others. Right? Instead of seeing the other as bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, right? The other becomes, it was this woman who gave me the apple, right? Or the fruit, and I ate it. So that kind of separation, and you see it all the way down the line, right? You see it in Adam's response to, or what he says about Eve. You also see it in what Eve says about the serpent, right? Oh, it's the serpent that gave it to me. So this and then of course the consequences with the rest of creation, right? We're gonna work by the by the sweat of your brow and the thorns and the thistles, right? And all that stuff. So I think what's really fascinating is if that's true, right? If that is the fundamental breakdown, this rejection of our dependency, that dependency with which we were actually created, and that's good, it leads us to ask that next question of, okay, so how do we fix it? Right? What does it look like to enter back into relationships with others that we understand not as a detriment to us, but as something that actually constitutes our identity, right? What does it mean to recognize that I cannot be fully myself outside of relationship with others, just as the Father is not Father without the Son, right? It's a constitutive identity, or a constitutive relationship, right? So too, perhaps it's true to say that I need the other. I need I need people who are different and who see the world differently, whose experiences are different, in order for me to actually fully find myself, to know myself. And social Trinitarians in the room would also say, and to image God, right? If the image of God is itself constituted by this kind of relationship, being with and for the other, bound together in love, then in our own kind of manifestation of those relationships, those types of relationship, like that's how we more clearly image God. So I'd say, like, to the Christian who wants to know what to do next, I would say become friends with people who are not like you. And if you're not in an area where you have a lot of racial diversity around, I would say, first of all, maybe look around a little bit harder, because there probably are people. But other types of people who are different from you in other ways, right? That can also habituate you into a different way of seeing yourself and seeing the world.
Well, thank you, everyone. We've gotten through our 3 questions, so we'll use the remaining time just to kind of open it up and get a chance for you to kind of interact with each other based on what you've said. So probably about 10 minutes to do this kind of engagement.
I mean, I suppose I have a question for Chris and Alan. Do you see, so Chris, you mentioned the shift from focus on salvation to focus on politics, right? I'm wondering if, for you, the idea of the democratic American system, like as it exists in the American social imaginary, right? This way of that people generally tend to see America, like, what is America, right? That America as it's in terms of identity. Do you see people, or do you kind of get a sense that there is this almost taking of Christian concepts and then like projecting it onto American culture, right? So entry into American culture being a form of salvation. I guess I'm wondering, like, can we how much can we really separate, right? Oh, it's a focus on salvation to a focus on politics. Is it possible to say politics has become its own form of salvation?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the church as an organization, it's really changed. I mean, fundamentalism was hiding out as Christians, and what was called neo-evangelicalism in the early 60s was fundamentalists coming out of hiding and trying to be more relevant and engage with society. And Billy Graham at that time was a big deal because he held campaigns that weren't just fundamentalist churches. They were mainline churches, and he wanted everyone to come. And he was criticized for that. But, as places like Fuller Seminary and so forth came along, evangelicalism became more respectable and so forth. What's happened lately, I really can't understand it. I really don't know what's happened. Why so many, 80% of people that identify as evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. And it's startling and scary. And I do think they confuse America with, Christian nationalism, where you, this white person in this white church, are the hope for the future of America. And everyone's different than you is a threat to the future of America. That's what we're up against. And I don't know how that's played out at Azusa Pacific, but Azusa, of course, is one of the most diverse colleges, Christian colleges in the country. And that's to our credit, our benefit. But so it's, I don't know, I feel a little pessimistic about this. I was really glad to find what Esau Macaulay had to say, because it really is kind of a plan that you could work with. And it's biblical. It's a biblical plan.
I think I have a little bit more hope in that the next generation understands the concept of both and versus either or. That might be a shift from modernism to postmodernism, perhaps, but it's this idea that they understand the importance of respecting the individual, but at the same time also know we're in this together. And I think that the current climate of the church is really about protecting one's individual freedoms to be able to do what they want to do unimpeded by government or other social forces and things such as that. And again, as I said earlier, when you mention things such as collectivism or socialism, things like that, that's just one step more towards communism, and of course, all the things that are implied there. The next generation does not see that relationship between socialism and communism, at least not in the way that we remember it, as like the Cold War and things such as that. So I think as the next generation starts to become the major demographic, that I'm hoping to see that they'll have a better understanding of our need to be able to work together, and not so much be concerned about working together as somehow being mutually exclusive from maintaining one's own freedoms and rights. And I think I'm hoping that will be the direction things are going. So I'm a little more optimistic, but of course, I'm not quite sure. I would say that the current climate in the church, if you think about who's in charge, that particular generation is getting older. So it will be curious to see what's going to happen as the next generation moves in, whether or not we will see the kind of change that I'm hoping to see. I have something for this group, and I was intrigued by something that Dr. Christopherson said, and it followed up by Dr. Wong. The thing about racism as being a sin, that as soon as you said that struck me, and I guess I want just a little bit more, articulation over that, over exactly, especially in biblical terms, what does it mean when we talk about racism as a sin? What exactly is a good way to articulate that particular perspective?
What do you mean by a good way to articulate it?
I guess the idea makes sense to me, but I'm not sure. See, if someone were to ask me, if I said that I think racism is a sin, okay, from I guess either from from a scriptural basis or from a faith perspective, how would I be able to express that to, say, if someone else had asked me, okay, so why do you think racism is a sin? What would be a good way to respond?
I see.
One simple thing is you're not respecting the dignity of every human being. You are dismissing whole categories of people. And that is exactly what slavery was about. And that legacy is deeply embedded in our culture. Just, they argued for, for years, hundreds of years, over exactly what Black people were. Were they another species? Were they just, animals? Were they this? Were they that? But never came to terms with their full humanity. That's sinful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'd probably return back to this idea of, we were created. I mean, Bonhoeffer basically makes the argument that relationship with the other was intended to help remind us of our proper posture in relationship with God, right? Because the other functions for us as a limit. There are ways in which, even if you're married, right, for I don't know, like 30 years, there's still things
51.
about this. What's that?
52.
50 or 52 years, right? There's still things that at times might surprise you, right? Or things that, you can't read this other person's mind, right? You might know them so well, but there are still things that are distinct about them, right? And so the other confronts us with the limit of being a finite creature who cannot read other people's minds, who cannot move through other people's bodies, right? And so for Bonhoeffer, he takes that idea and says, this reminds us what it means to remember our creaturely condition, and therefore remember that we are dependent upon God, to not try to usurp the place of God, right? To not try to be infinite as God is infinite. And so, when that breaks down, right, when the fall happens and that starts to break down, we start to see this other no longer as a good limit, but now as an obstacle that needs to be overcome, and a problem and a threat, right, to my own stability and my own capacity to be infinite, right? And so this is kind of linked back with what you were saying, Alan, around American individualism and the culture of American individualism to try to, I'm going to create myself into whoever I want to be, regardless of my past or my community. Like, none of that stuff actually matters, because I can be whomever I want to be. Like, that's part of the American individualism and part of the American dream. But the truth is, right, we are always constituted through our communities. And the people who oftentimes make it, are people who are dependent upon others, right? We like, who we are is constituted by the people who have gone before us and the stories that exist there, and the way in which we were even imagined before we were born, right? We're always born into a context and given meaning in a context. So yeah, part of the sin then of racism, both on an individual level and a societal level, right, is this treatment of the other as object or as threat that needs to be overcome, as opposed to an other who helps to constitute who I am.
I just like that you draw the analogy of relationship with the other, both in the context of marriage as well as the question I was asking. So basically, you're offering both I think a constructive step towards resolving some of the issues of racism, and also giving marital counseling. So you're actually stepping in my business, but I'm okay with that. So thank you for sharing that. By the way, in my case, 21 years. So
Congratulations. That's great.
Well, I'd love to see some vibrant new leadership in American evangelicalism. Get some things straightened out.
Yeah.
I think what saddens me to a certain degree, although it may be just a question of terminology, is that with my students, a good number of them no longer identify themselves as Christian. They identify themselves as followers of Christ, but they don't want to be associated with the term Christian. And I understand it, but there's something about that that's really troublesome. And have we made the term Christian a politicized concept, as opposed to as defining one's faith That to me is tragic, at least in my mind. I think that there's something that I just find to be inherently disturbing. And I understand it to a certain degree, but again, I in some respects, I appreciate people using their faith in all aspects of their life, including their politics. But I also think that one has to be careful that because you have a quote unquote spiritual perspective, and it goes back to my comments about American exceptionalism, does that blind you from seeing other perspectives? I think that's what concerns me.
I think that's right. I also think that it's true to say that evangelical Christianity tends to be the loudest of our kind of various Christian communities in terms of in public. And as a result of that, I think that a lot of students, they're coming to develop different social sensibilities, and then they feel like their faith is inherently inconsistent, right? Or somehow incompatible with their faith. But the truth of the matter is that that Christianity is actually quite broad, and there are different positions along the way, right? When it comes to kind of social issues. And so I think part of our jobs as teachers is to introduce them, right? That you can be a Christian and be committed in this way to certain social issues. So yeah.
Great point.
I'm just going to offer a few concluding remarks and then end the session. So I would just re-emphasize what my panelists have said and underscore the fact is this topic is actually really important. It's really serious. I think an understanding of the role and relationship of the church towards a historical expression of racism. It's a serious condemnation on our conscience. It's something that we should take very seriously and think about the ways in which they have come together in our own communities and find ways to respond to that. I think that's really an important thing to bring to light. And the reason why we're talking about it today. I think what makes it so serious for me is the fact that the attack on the Capitol wasn't done with people in a hood. Like their faces weren't covered, And I think our imagination, especially since they say the rise of the KKK, is that there was still a sensibility that you didn't make it flagrant that you were doing these things, and now it is out in the open. And how do we then understand that? It's definitely not showing that we're moving in the right direction when it comes to this relationship between Christianity and white nationalism. But I think what I also appreciated from my panelists is not only telling the truth, exposing the problem, but having a really robust sense of hope and ways to move out of it. I think that's so important that we identify the problem, but we also understand this isn't the end of the story. This doesn't need to be the way things are. I think Jess's point, the importance of being with people who are different than you, I think would be a really first good step for a lot of Christians in this country. As long as we stay in our own little bubble with people like ourselves, then we definitely will trend towards this again. So it is important to reach out and understand people who are different, humanize people who are different than you, and bring it back full circle in terms of what is the right relationship that we should have with one another and with God. And that is one of interdependence and respect and the fullness of our humanity. So I really appreciate all of your comments and what you contributed today. So I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you for presenting your thoughts on the issue. And I want to thank the people who are watching this session. So I'm glad you came. I hope you enjoyed it. And I guess we'll sign off for now. All right.